Good morning, everyone. A warm welcome to all the participants from Team English at HHMSPD NSS College for Women, Niramangarh. I'm Asha Prabhakaran, Assistant Professor at the department. Today is really a wonderful day for us, all of us here at the department. We are hosting thousands of participants across the nation. We are very proud to organize this national webinar on contemporary feminism, politics, and priorities. Without much delay, now let me invite our dear head of the department, Dr. Devika S., to introduce the resource person and welcome her as well as the participants. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Asha. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're.
Good morning, everybody. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to the first webinar that the Department of English of this college is hosting. First, I welcome our dear principal, Dr. Jayashree, who has been the motivating force behind this webinar. She'll be joining us shortly. Next, let me introduce the resource person of the session, Dr. Sharon B.S. She's Assistant Professor at the Department of Comparative Literature and India Studies, FLO Hyderabad. She obtained her doctoral degree in English from Mahatma Gandhi University, Kerala, and her thesis is on Islam and women in Kerala. Her areas of interest include obviously gender studies, film studies, especially regional cinema, urban studies, Malayalam literature. She has published extensively in these areas. She is a bilingual scholar. She has published in Malayalam a book titled, which would translate into English as Feminism, Nationalism, Triple Talaq, The Politics of Counter Discourse. Her current area of research, or her current focus, is colonial modernity and the evolution of the codified Muslim law. On behalf of the Department of English, the IQAC, and everyone else on this platform, I extend to Dr. Sharon a very cordial welcome. Next, IQAC convener Dr. Shubha R. Nair, other members of the IQAC, participants who have joined us from different parts of the country, my colleagues and students, a very warm welcome to each one of you. I wish everyone a fruitful session. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, this seminar is part of the webinar series organized by the IQAC of our college. I invite Dr. Shubha R. Nair, Coordinator IQAC, to offer her felicitations on behalf of the principal and college.
Thank you, Asha. Actually, it's a privilege to be here because this is actually the webinar series, part of the webinar series conducted by the college IQAC under, of course, the under the advice of our principal, Dr. P. Jayashree. And I'm extremely happy actually because this webinar by English, actually the subject is so relevant and it has attracted so much of interest when we announced it. I think nearly 1,500 participants had requested to join, but was sort of because of the technical problems, we could accommodate only 250 in the webinar here in the meet, and the remaining we are live streaming around the country. And first of all, I would like to congratulate the Department of English for arranging such a wonderful program. And I'm extremely thankful to Dr. Sharon because the topic that she has taken up is actually, it's something that attracts so much attention and actually needs to be discussed in today's scenario. And I'm extremely thankful to you, ma'am, for taking up your time to spend some time with us. And I wish all the participants will have a what you call very informative and intellectually stimulating time hearing to your words. And on behalf of the college and everyone in the Department of English as well as IQAC of the college, I extend all my wishes for the successful completion of this webinar. Thank you, Asha. Devika.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, for the much awaited segment of this webinar, may I invite Dr. Sharon B.S., our resource person, onto this webinar for her presentation. The platform is now open to you, Sharon. Please.
Thank you very much, the organizers, the college management, the Department of English, the IQAC of NSS College. It's my pleasure and privilege to meet you all today morning. And in fact, it was such a heartening message to me to hear that so many have registered, and it's a topic of interest for many friends and students all over the country. So it's actually a strange moment for all of us. We are thinking in terms of connection. We are thinking in terms of connecting across platforms, across places through a new medium. Partly it's because of kind of we are talking about this context of pandemic now, which in a very paradoxical way bring people together. Like, earlier when we would think about a webinar, we always used to, a seminar or a conference, we always used to think in terms of commuting, convenience, going, time, specifications. But now, in some ways, this is a paradox because a tragedy or a very complex historical reality brings us all together. And that's not the kind of mode or the kind of reason that we all expected would bring us together. But here we are, and we are trying to make the best out of the current moment. And I actually brought in or invoked this idea of the pandemic at this moment, because this is also a moment where we are thinking in terms of gender in all its complicated dimensions. And there are a lot of things that we used to take for granted in the past. For instance, the role of women at home. We were all comfortably placed in contemporary. When I talk about we, I know I'm talking to an academic audience, and I feel the ones who are listening to me is also fixed in that kind of an academic intellectual environment. So I'm talking in terms of this comfortably placed middle class, or the upper middle class intellectually engaged women of this country, or men of this country, who are we were so comfortably placed in our modern households, and we used to think that okay, we have moved a little further from the concerns of feminism or concerns of gender discourse, things that used to haunt us in the past. And we always used to think of inequality at home, sharing of domestic work, those kind of things as like a thing of the past, because the household that we used to have was kind of ideal in that sense. We used to share things between like sexes, between gender, but all on a sudden the pandemic pushed us back into the personal spaces, which we thought, or which we thought is now an egalitarian space, and it is making us speak or ask questions, or we have to get back to the resolutions and think what was wrong or what went wrong. All of a sudden, we have a very crowded space, the space which was so personal because we always had the public. But now, what is our social, what's our public space? It's only the virtual becomes the social or the public for us. So whatever we resolved in the personal space, whenever we talk in terms of modernity, we also used to talk in terms of the personal, the private, the inside. Often, like in colonial modernity or in the Bengal context, we talk about the ghar bahar, the inside-outside dynamics. And in this, like today morning, when I'm addressing you, when you are listening to me, we are also thrown in the middle of a kind of turmoil where we don't have this dichotomy working anymore. There is no inside outside anymore. There is all we have is the inside, and which also comes back to us in a harsh way. It tries to tell us we haven't resolved things in the inside. We thought that we took it for granted for many years, saying that, okay, we have moved, we are modern. And therefore, I think it is very important to ask certain questions about our modernity. And the questions should start from our private, personal insights, because like, keeping things aside and thinking that everything is good about the inside is not going to resolve our issues anymore. And so what I'm going to ask at this moment, or like, a couple of questions, a couple of concerns that kept coming back to me when I was working on my thesis, and also further after that. For instance, like as it is given in the introduction, I have done my thesis, or my PhD research was based on women and Islam in Kerala. I read a lot about contemporary Muslim feminism and feminism in general. I teach feminism as a course in the university. So these things are there, but apart from that, like, there were recurring questions that kept on coming back when I was talking in terms of gender. I was talking, one is the question of the whole idea of the polarization between two genders. Of course, like, it must be a familiar discourse to most of you. The idea of gender galaxy, the multiple dimensions of gender, my work and like, post my PhD. One is this whole idea of modernity. What who consists, like, or what is Indian modernity all about? Or because this question again, like, whose modernity, the idea of alternate modernities, all these, like, it keep coming back in questions raised by historians from South Asia. But as a Muslim woman, or as somebody who's interested in the question of modernity and women, it kept on coming back to me, like, what am I talking about when I talk in terms of feminism? And in the beginning itself, I want to tell you something, like, I'm not talking about the underrepresented Muslim woman here. I'm not talking about, like, the questions which have been often raised, in which these are, like, very relevant questions also, where is the Muslim woman's voice? But the idea is not just to leave it there and say, okay, Muslim woman is not represented or misrepresented in our modern formations. But I'm also going to ask, what is the particular nature of modernity which creates certain images? And moving further from this idea of the modern, I also want to interrogate the idea of modernity itself. Like, is it so important to be modern? Or what is this idea of, like, let us all be modern? It becomes so taken for granted kind of a question. But there are so many uh, there are so many important concerns that keep coming back in terms of this ideal modern woman. So my perspective will be based on some interventions raised by women of color, women, Muslim women, Dalit women, women who are often termed as the postmodernists. For instance, like, whenever we talk in terms of, like, countering the idea of universal modernity, the idea of universal human rights, often these kind of questions, if you read your Facebook page, or if you just get into any kind of social media discussion, whenever somebody talks in terms of identity, the question is immediately negated. The person is muted using the term postmodernist. This weird postmodernists, they come up with all kinds of concerns, and like, the thing that they are talking about in terms of identity is so weird. So this kind of, like, a writing off that we often tend to give to the concerns raised by people who talk about identity. But why for me, or like, anybody who looks at that part of our feminist discourse, finds it a very problematic negation, That is where I'm going to focus a major part of today's talk on. And then, like, I also want to share with you, maybe, like, if you try to analyze this historically and then, like, move on to some contemporary questions, some contemporary issues that came up, where, like, these I want to use as a kind of like, models where I can exemplify. I can try to say, like, this is what it is, or this is where I came across this kind of a problematic. So to start with, I just want to think in terms of the idea of gender discourse, or idea of feminism as such, how it has been given to us. What is this feminist politics that we are talking about at this moment, and how it developed historically using a certain idea of liberation and politics. And at the very outset, I also want to say this: I'm not talking against feminism. I would like to call myself a feminist, but there is something very important that feminism need to, or like feminism should take into account, and that is where, like, I'm pointing at. So I would like to refer to a particular work by an important feminist of our time. Her first work, or first important book, Split Decisions. The author is called Janet Halley, and this particular work is quite important in the sense, it is like, maybe I can show you. Uh, Yeah, so I'm talking about this book, Split Decisions, How and Why to Take a Break from Feminism. This book was published in the year 2006. And in this book, she asked, as the title shows us, it's a very important question that she makes. And she is asking us, why should we take a break from feminism? And she's trying to say that feminism is like so unaware of its own power at this moment. So I am like, when I use the term feminism here, as she has used, she's talking about a particular form of feminism, or a particular nature of feminism, which is like, feminism, or the feminist discourse that gets into very powerful position. Uh, like when we say women's discourse, I often, like, I know it could be a bit provocative when I say feminism and its power at this moment, partly because what has happened, or what is happening across uh, these days, or like, the last week, if you have been watching the television, you would. And then I'm trying to say feminism is a very powerful discourse. Some of you might laugh at me, I know that, but I am also talking about the informed, intellectual, academic community. And I'm trying to say that feminism is a powerful discourse, either in India or like anywhere in the world. Feminism, I would like to put that feminism within quotes, because I'm talking about dominance feminism, a feminism that is very dominant, a feminism that is like accepted, a feminist discourse which is a viable mode, or a viable tool for people to invoke and use against other oppressed or marginalized people. I know here I am turning a bit provocative. That's what I said. It's a very provocative statement to make, especially from our realities. But I'm not the first one, and there have been many people who are trying to raise this question. It is problematic because, for instance, like, when I say feminism, or like this within quotes feminism that I used here, this particular mode of feminism is very dominant. So you can, I said this mode of feminism is used against marginalized communities, against people who are marginalized. So here, that is why Janet Haley said, see, feminism should be aware of its own power. It's in a powerful position. It's not like, you walk into a campus, for instance. I belong to like one of the very important universities in the country. So feminist discourse is available to everyone there. And we are talking about that kind of an audience, people, like you interact as informed audience or as informed participants in a gender discourse. So you know what is equality between sexes, you know about the galaxy when it comes to genders. So all these are like, these are we are informed. But how this feminism takes over when it comes to other communities, that is an important question that we need to ask. And there is an often like invoke, like people often talk about this particular work of Laila Abu Lughod, the do Muslim women need saving, this particular work in which she tries to point out how the US used the backwardness of Muslim women, or the aggressive nature of Muslim male or Muslim community who oppress Muslim women and force them into veil. And this discourse was used in the US at a particular point to bomb Afghanistan. That is the argument Laila Abu Lughod makes in this particular work. So she's trying to say, see, Muslim women are used, or like, they are pawns in this whole game. So in the name of the rights of Muslim women, what is happening is an imperialist interest is getting justified there. US imperialism is in many ways, it asserts itself using this particular discourse of the downtrodden, oppressed Muslim women. And if you look at a lot of those Muslim women who become the mouthpieces of or the ambassadors, rights ambassadors for Western media. Think about Malala Yousafzai, think about Mukhtar Mai of Pakistan, Taslima Nasrin from South Asia. So these are people who talk about rights of Muslim women. But how these rights discourses turn out in a highly, I would say, tense environment where a particular community gets ostracized again and again. And in this context, if we think in terms of the rights of Muslim women, we can also look at the discourse related to triple talaq we had over the past few years, and the final verdict from Supreme Court, the law which came up, which was opposed by a lot of people because they felt it is unfair. It's unfair mainly because if I think it was one of those activists was trying to point out that you look at this law, a Muslim man who divorces his wife or marries again, he will get this much of punishment, and it is treated as a criminal offense. Whereas in other communities, like if you try to look at the law, it's like so unfair on the Muslim male, because the Hindu man who does the same crime may not get similar kind of a punishment. So when this discourse came up in India, I mean the triple talaq discourse, when it was raised, some feminists, like, they try to point out that, see, this is so unfair on a community because this is something that should come from within the community. And here, like, it shouldn't be juxtaposed into a kind of situation or a statement where, like, okay, Sharon is trying to justify triple talaq. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say how this discourse was used to alienate the Muslim male in this community, in this society, the Muslim men who were already ostracized, who were already at a very marginalized kind of state in this country. There are a lot of other things that Muslim women would want. They want education, they want job, they want equal opportunities. So why the feminists who went to the court, like, of course there were a few victims, but then this whole jargon was taken up, like, against the whole discourse against triple talaq was taken up by a lot of people, which turned out to be problematic at a later stage, because okay, this is the right moment to raise it, because at this moment if you, but then that kind of an opportunism to say, okay, because some kind of anti-Muslim sentiments is running in the country at this moment, so if you speak about triple talaq right now, it's the right time to get it abolished. So is that the right way of thinking about or producing or developing a discourse in terms of Muslim women's rights? So that was the question that some of us were trying to raise at that moment. Like Abu Lukat talks about what happened in the Western world in terms of the rights of Afghan women. So there was this huge campaign called Save Afghan Women campaign, raised it was, and the leading figure of this campaign was the wife of American president of that time, Laura Bush, and she was like talking about Save Afghan Women. And recently, you remember this photograph that came up where somebody presented to American president this photograph of Afghan women wearing mini skirts in the 70s and trying to say that, okay, this was the situation there, and now, like, because of religious conservatism, it's pretty difficult on the women there. So this kind of talking about what women wear as it becomes a very formative kind of tool to develop and propagate a particular discourse. What I'm so, and against this, there is a counter argument raised by Saba Mahmood, the feminist. She is trying to say, like, why do you think wearing mini skirts is the marker of a woman's right? So this whole idea of human rights need to be rethought in a particular way. In what way would we address the question of human rights, or what is wrong with our rights debates at this particular moment? This is an important question that I would like to raise. And from there, probably we need to move on to questions like, when we say women's rights in feminism, who are the women we are talking about? Whose rights are we talking about in terms of women's rights? Are there women with different kinds of rights, different kinds of aspirations, different kinds of inclinations? So how would you look at women in religion? How would you look at women who do not get such dominant positions in society? How would you think in terms of when I say women, I am thinking about women with as a kind of women with all their differences, all different kinds of power. How would you say, the whole formations of power that would involve this category called women? Or when we say feminism in India or feminism in Kerala, who are these feminists who speak for everyone? They would speak for Dalit women, they would speak for Muslim women, they would speak for all rural, urban, this, that. So whose voice is heard in terms of this whole idea of women? That's an important question that we need to talk about. And when we say liberatory politics of feminism, this particular idea of liberation, whose liberation are we talking point, and who will liberate? That the agency in terms of feminist discourse that needs to be questioned a little bit. And this kind of a feminist, some of the feminists have some people who had a problem with this kind of feminism getting into a very dominant mode of discourse. They talked about this and they called it feminism in the governance mode, like feminists who enters into a phase almost like a state-like power, where a very authoritarian state has this kind of power, or state is an established source of power. And likewise, feminism also, this governance, feminism in the governance mode also enter into that kind of a phase. And often, when you say, for instance, feminist, what is the kind of critique that this feminism produces? So somebody you call that person, he's not feminist enough, or she is not feminist enough. The woman who is veiled, the woman who lives a very spiritual life, all these people may not form the part of that part of feminism where, like, you wouldn't naturally give a kind of agency to this group of these group of women, and therefore they also, so there is something normative about feminism. For instance, like, to be a feminist in India, what are the kind of, like, I call myself a feminist, and the moment I call myself a feminist, there are certain embellishments, or I'm not saying there are, but shouldn't we ask ourselves, there are certain norms that we set for a feminist. You should be working, you shouldn't be, like, overtly religious, you should dress in a certain way. Definitely you cannot wear what would I say, like, if I wear what we call the veil, the parda, if I wear that and then I come to the public and claim myself to be a feminist, I don't know, like 60% of the people or more would think, okay, how can she call herself a feminist because she's dressed in a way. So who designs the norms of this feminism, especially in the intellectual world, in the academic world? Then, when the triple talaq debate came up in this country, what was least heard was the voice of Muslim women. There were definitely a few Muslim women whose pictures were projected as the kind of, like, the front face of the victim, the victim faces of talaq, triple talaq. But at the same time, the people who raised discourses, the debates related to the rights of these women, those were not Muslim women. But what we saw in the course of this movement was a lot of practicing, believing Muslim women coming out and saying this is not very important for us. We also realized the motive behind this. And that was a moment for the country to see that, like, agency of Muslim women cannot be, like, taken for granted, and people should stop speaking or appropriating the voice of practicing Muslim women. And in the history of Kerala also, if you look at, like, the contemporary politics in Kerala, like, over the past few years, a lot of issues came up which made us, like, reflect on this whole idea of Muslim women's agency. Hadia's issue, I think, like, because I'm speaking from Kerala and majority of the audience here would know this, would remember this, the right of a woman to, like, convert, marry the person one would want, and then, like, embrace the religion one would want. But then the complications that came up, the state intervening, the state deciding, okay, you are forced into this, and then the whole debates. So we saw that, and end of it, we also saw, like, how Muslim women tried to raise their voice and try to say that, okay, stop, you're speaking about my rights, and this is what rights mean to us. And this particular point, I don't know, like, how feminism is going to engage with this idea of rights in a very nuanced way. So when we talk about ethics and politics of feminist engagements with national and international, local power structures, I would say, like, for instance, the NGOization of feminism, the whole lot of the question of funding, the question of like, the representative feminist role in most of the organizations. You need to have a feminist to complete a stage. And there are feminists who usually, for instance, like, haven't you noticed, if a meeting happens, there will be, like, X, Y, Z, and then the feminist will be there. So because in the corner, you also need the woman, the feminist. But this feminist is like somebody who works so much along with the state. I'm not saying, like, there is an overt kind of alliance between the state and this dominant mode of feminism, but I'm trying to say that this itself becomes, the dominant mode of feminism itself becomes a power center. And the people who get called for TV debates, people who get to speak on behalf of other women in the society, people who get into committees and all these. So this form of feminism makes sense to people in power, power elite, it is called. And this feminism actually is the result of a successful mode of a successful movement, I would say. So you see, like, feminism is in a very successful position. If I say, I don't have any qualms in saying feminism is quite successful. And is it possible for feminism to raise a critique of its own? And it has been successfully, responsibly done by many feminists in the country, many of them, like, rethinking, revisiting, trying to say that, okay, now it is time for feminism to raise its a critique of its own. It's not like, for instance, when Dalit feminism as a movement started in this country, we heard this, like they're trying to say that we speak differently. We don't speak the voice of the mainstream feminists. And now the Muslim women also have started saying this. We speak differently. Muslim women obviously do not speak like the dominant feminist discourse. So this whole idea of appropriating women's rights in the name of women's rights, that should stop, and probably we should move further from that, and the critique for feminism should come from within. It has started already, and I'm sure, like, feminism being a very successful, responsible movement will be able to cope with that kind of a critique, and probably that would be what we should aim at. And so what I'm trying to say is this whole idea of governmentality is like, if we take borrow from Foucault. Foucault was talking about governmentality, the idea of support. Feminism gains as a dominant mode from power structures. So this power of feminism needs to be critiqued. And like, when we say dominant feminism, there are also, like, we should also keep into account the exhaustive amount of, like, the nature of critique that comes from women, other women. I said use the term other women because I'm talking about women who do not fall into this whole category of dominant feminist discourse. So they've been, like, jovially they use the term 9 to 5 feminists of dominant feminism, because, like, from 9 to 5 you live the life of a feminist, you go out, you do all your intellectual engagement, you get back to the household where all those things exist intact, like, your casteism, your religious segregations, your elitism, all that work after 5 o'clock in back in your home. So is this 9 to 5 feminist, or the mode of 9 to 5 feminist activism will not work for people that I was talking about. Like, it won't work for Muslim feminists or Dalit feminists or Black feminists or of people who have a different kind of reality. And because feminism has been constantly used in this kind of a context, in the intellectually elite, academic, and also, like, the middle class safe zones, in some ways, hasn't it lost its political edge, is a question that we need to ask, and that we need to raise. And now, when we think about Indian women's movement, like, historically how it evolved, how it emerged, there are different kinds of histories to Indian women's movement. There is one way is, like, tracing the whole dominant discourse, and then trying to say that women's movement is this, but at the same time, the whole lot of different, diverse kind of movements, diverse kind of activities that got into Indian women's movement. Often it is kind of, like, kept aside to give a very dominant narrative to India's women's movement, I feel. For instance, like, at some point, it also becomes too much of a legal engagement. We talk in terms of rape law, we talk in terms of punishment. It's almost like it has this structural shift of Anglo-American feminism at some point. So in many ways, it is also, like, it is tied to other things like state and foreign funding, even the whole idea of non-governmental organizations and feminism. So with the emergence of all these, like, is it feminism has lost its political edge, and has it ended up as kind of a 9 to 5 engagement for people? And adding on to this, like, you think in terms of the conservative political alliances. So triple talaq, who were the people who were talking about triple talaq, the rights of Muslim women. Of course, feminists can say like, okay, we don't go along with those people who are right wing and who are talking about a ban of triple talaq. But end of the day, where would it end up? Like, who is at the other end, receiving end of this discourse? So there are very conservative political alliances happening, which we don't expect from, because we think of feminism as a very liberal, very broad kind of ideology. And then when this kind of political alliances happen, it is like, it's quite strange. And adding on to this, you have this whole idea of globalization, then the fragmentation, etc., etc. So, in this kind of a context, losing the political edge of feminism, maybe this is a moment to rethink and to revise the goals of feminism from a different kind of aspiration. And when we talk about the strands of gender discourses, I told you, like, I also want to get into a kind of historical um, archive where we would see how feminism evolved in a particular format, as a particular discourse. For instance, like, if you go to the colonial archives, there is a particular framework in which feminist discourse evolves. Where the colonial mission becomes a civilizing mission. So for the colonizer, it is very easy to look at a particular group of people and try to say, like, look at the way they treat their women, and they need to be modernized. So this whole idea of modernizing women was a colonial um, um, goal at that point. But the intention was, it is more or less like the intention of triple talaq, how triple talaq is going to modernize the community, banning of triple talaq is going to modernize the community. So this whole idea of civilizing mission and the colonial archives, again, feminists have worked extensively on it. Lata Mani's work on Sati. There's a very interesting work, Malika Laula's, at least some of you would have heard about it, his work on the colonial harem, where the whole idea of French postcard and the photographic gaze of the colonizer is being looked at. So in the colonial harem, what happens is, when the French in 1830, when the French colonization of Algeria started in the 1830s and it went on till 1960s. So initially, when the colonizer went there, their idea was to have this exotic. They had this exotic images of Algerian women in their minds, but what they saw there was like women who are veiled. Instead, they printed these photographs in the postcards, the French postcards, and the image of the nude women, Algerian women in these postcards gave a particular idea to the public that this is how the Algerian women dress. But uh, so this actually, in some ways, the colonial target was to colonize the community, to colonize this space, but at the same time, what happened is, you have a whole lot of um, people getting appropriated here, people who are um, pictured, caricatured in a particular way. I just wanted to, like, if you look at one of those images, I'm just trying to share one image. Yeah. So I hope you can see this. This from one of those French postcards, and if you look at this, how a veiled woman is represented here as, like, this is not a veiled woman. This is the image of an Algerian. And so if you look at this, what?
Excuse me, ma'am. I think it's not. We are not able to see it.
Just give me a second. Yes. I hope you can see it now. Uh,
Yeah, yes.
yeah. So these were like, the cover pages of the postcards that I was talking about, how these women were represented in the French postcard. So this is like the colonial gaze towards the native women. And this gaze in many ways had like, it had a lot of hidden intentions. The idea was to talk in terms of, think in terms of the civilizing mission, think in terms of also, so the latest reading is also to see how women are used as weapons in a war, like what happened in Afghanistan, what happened at the time of triple talaq debate in India, and even in terms of the Hadia case. So in all these moments, what we see is a kind of like, so the invocation of women's rights in these debates are not like innocent invocations, and they don't have the best motives of, or the like, the motive is not the best for Muslim women or Dalit women or whatever. You're taking it up as a kind of, as a tool, as a device. And regarding this, if you think in terms of the, like, so I started talking about the colonial archives. So if you get into the colonial archives, you come across this kind of discourses. And since I'm working a little on colonial modernity and law at this point, I also, there are a lot of surprising instances where you think how the native law itself is appropriated by the colonial rulers, and then like, a particular form of representation happens there. This whole tension between minority rights, the uniform civil code, it all started during the colonial period. And there is again this important work by Sabah Mahmood on the work is titled Religious Difference in a Secular Age, where she tries to talk about minority rights, how this whole idea of minority rights evolved in the colonial period. She uses colonial Egypt as an example here, but it works quite well. That framework or that kind of a research can be done in India also. So if you make law a subject of historical inquiry, it would surprise us, like see the kind of personal motives, agenda that has gone into this whole idea of law as such, or a legality as such. Now, what I'm trying to say is at this moment, probably we should think about the value of rights. Whose rights are we talking about? What is the value of right? Or like what you think of as right, does it have any value to me? So when we talk about feminism, is its goal getting like, so we talk about women's rights, but who are these women again? So as a feminist goal, can we talk about rights anymore? Because rights is so diverse and rights is so problematic a thing. For instance, like, do you want the right to divorce or not? Do you want the right to be divorced or not? Do you want the right to, like, marry or not? Abortion? Feminism, at some point, the dominant feminism that I'm talking about, it's all about this rights discourse. Right to abort, right to reproductive rights, we talk about equal wages rights. The concept of equal wages rights, and the debate surrounding it, Bell Hooks has a very important response to it. So Bell Hooks says, when you say you need equal wage, you're only talking about the women who go out and work. You're not talking about, you go out, you work, you have a particular space in the office, you are quite happy there, but you also have some woman who is taking care of your things at home, as a child, as a help, as a caretaker for your child, the domestic help, somebody who takes care of your cooking, this, that. So rights is like, a very problematic kind of thing. So the whole liberal rights framework need to be revamped if we are talking about feminism and rights. And in the, like, because liberalism, if you think in terms of the colonial framework, in the liberal aspiration is always like, so the colonized is not liberal enough. They sit in the perpetual, within quotes, the perpetual waiting rooms of history to be liberated. To, they are not up to like, they haven't reached up to that mark. So this perpetual waiting rooms of history always wait. People wait in this waiting rooms of history in liberalism to be like the rightful individual. So Muslim woman is not civilized enough. Dalit woman is not civilized enough. This person is not civilized enough. So who is civilized? So that kind of like, this idea of rights as a feminist goal needs to be like, rethought. We should think in terms of revamping this whole concept of rights. Probably that is like, the major point I wanted to talk about today. And then like to connect it to several other concerns that we are thinking about. For instance, this whole idea of rights, how it becomes so manipulated in certain contexts. There is another interesting work that I want to cite here, that is Sarah Faris's work on femo-nationalism. So she says in Europe, especially in Northern Europe, you talk about women's rights, the refugee women's rights in a particular context. Most of the refugees there who are also Muslims. So there, actually, there is a strange alliance happening. She is like, quite concerned about this kind of an association. She says, so you talk about these women's rights, but you're using these question of women's rights to form an alliance with the right-wing groups who are so much against refugees, who are so much against, like, opening up your space for others. So you say these women are suffering, but who are, like, the oppressors here? The oppressors would be the male at her place, the male refugee. So there is an exploitation happening in terms of the rights of the labor rights of these women. But at the same time, they're also projected as victims so that you can use that discourse against this whole idea of refugee. Or like, so in that sense, this discourse actually, she says this is in many ways trying to come into a kind of strange, I wouldn't say illegal, she wouldn't say illegal, but it is like, a very strange, unethical kind of alliance between right wing and feminist goals. And this kind of unethical alliances, how are we going to stop these kind of alliances? And whenever, like, we talk about Hadia's rights at one point, but we are also slightly critical about, like, okay, did she convert on her own or was she forced to convert? Or like, when she goes there, what is she doing? Like, I think half the population of Kerala at that time was discussing this. What did she find in that oppressive community to go there? So these are the kind of concerns that came up or was projected as feminist concern. And how can feminism disguise itself and get into this kind of a very oppressive, very, I would say, like, a very dominant normative kind of mode, and then judge people who have rights, I would say, who also have rights to decide for themselves. So this is where, like, we need to rethink about the power of feminism. To get back into the earlier concern, or like, where I start, I would say feminism is a wonderful ideology, but at the same time, it needs to be like rethought. It needs to think in terms of rights. Or should we always talk about feminism in terms of law, in terms of, like, the idea of rights, like the whole idea of legality? For instance, like the recent the whole turnout and the idea, what happened with Nirbhaya case and all that. So is feminism about, the whole idea is about, idea of feminism, is it about punishment? Is it about marking certain people as not civilized, not good enough, to keep people perpetually waiting in, to borrow and modify this term, perpetual waiting rooms of history, I would say. So are we going to, like, keep people perpetually waiting in these waiting rooms, trying to say that, okay, they are not modern enough, let them, like, be a little more civilized and come in, and then we will all be like, all embrace a kind of egalitarianism. So I think I will take a break here, and I would like to answer questions at this point, if that's fine. Asha, is it okay? Should I
Yeah,
take up
sure.
questions?
Sure, Shireen. We will just, may I now request Dr. Ashwini to moderate this interaction session. Ashwini, please.
Before this, let me.
Hi,
Okay,
ma'am.
hi. Let me ask
Hi,
the
ma'am.
question. Are you giving the questions through chat or you'll be reading it out or something?
I'm reading it out, ma'am. Am I
Yeah,
audible?
yeah, fine, fine. Sure.
Okay, ma'am. It was awesome listening to you, and thank you so much for the light that for throwing light into the topic, contemporary feminism, politics, and priorities, which much focus on Islamic feminism, reality, and future. So, a few questions posted here. I would like to mention them. So, it is one by Amandeep Kaur. Do you think we need theory to resolve, or the one who wants to come out of shackles will come out by herself? How will you justify feminism in the Indian society? And it's a long question. Like, our culture is different from these Western theories. And at the end of the day in India, we find a woman is submissive to her husband. She will not easily walk out of marriage to secure it. She will at some point will be submissive. How will you address to this question?
I think I think I understand this question as the rights that we are talking about
Yeah, sure,
in
ma'am.
different societies. The different societies look at rights in different ways. So probably I was also trying to talk about that in the sense like feminism is so dominant discourse now that it also has certain ideas about rights. So I am thinking about a feminism which is not about this kind of a very dominant idea of rights, like right to marry, right to divorce, right not to divorce. Why should we always confine feminism to those kind of rights discourses? That's what I am thinking. And it is very problematic in the sense like, different communities have different traditions. So the idea of community is like, in some ways, it's a very problematic thing in the modern context because we are talking in terms of universal rights. We are talking in terms of universal alliances, and in the globalized context, again and again, like we are talking about we have entered a post national phase. So in the post national phase, when we talk about communities, it would look like, that is where I began. I think I would look like a kind of weird postmodernist who talk about community and identity and all that, where like we're talking about a world without borders. That is the paradox. When the world without borders is formed on one side, we are also like getting confined more and more into our elitist, casteist, whatever, like those kind of notions. So this conflict is always there. So in a modern universalist concept, we talk about women's rights in a particular way, but at the same time, like I'm asking you to think about feminism beyond that kind of a framework. Let us move a little beyond that and think about feminism in a different way. It's not just about rights and universal aspiration. As you rightly pointed out, a woman in marriage, like, whether she would want to be out or not, but we cannot also put it as a choice because choice often is not our choice. You think you choose, but at the same time, you don't choose. Your choices are made for you. So, in that sense, it's like, it's not even a choice. I hope you get me.
Yeah, sure, ma'am. So the next one is from Mausumi Chowdhury, and she would like to ask how far the Muslim feminists are successful in articulating the rights of Muslim women, wherein they themselves feel that they are marginalized.
It's an important question. Thanks, you raised it because I didn't touch upon that area at all. In Muslim feminism, definitely, like, you have different strands. There are Islamic feminists, for instance, people like Amina Wadud and Asma Barlas and all of them. Amina Wadud, she's like, she attempted to rewrite or like she made an important intervention trying to look at Quran from a feminist perspective. But there is also a counter argument because like there are different kinds of feminist strands there are different strands of feminism among Muslim women. There are people who think that people who talk about Muslim women's rights, as you said, like they themselves think that they don't have like they are deprived. So if you think in terms of that, there are like the conflict comes up. For instance, when Amina Wadud says Quran is feminist, or it is reinterpreted later by hadiths which are like not women friendly. So this kind of an argument is countered by the other side by trying to say that so she has again she has a very modern kind of framework in at hand. She thinks that the idea of Muslim women is to like prove that okay, Islam is also compatible with modern world. So you're trying to say modernity is again perfect, so we need this kind of a thing. So and there are so many Muslim women, Muslim feminists. For instance, Laila Abulukot, she would say like this avert interest in the rights of Muslim women that comes from a very different context and very different intention. So the idea is to tarnish the community as kind of like oppressed rather than to think in terms of the rights of Muslim women. So why are we so concerned about the rights of Muslim women? So that must be the question that we should be asking at this moment. And do you think all other communities treat their women well? Or do you think, again, the question, well, I'm asking only within quotes. It's not like for me to say that, but I'm trying to say, like, why Muslim women at this moment? Is this country overpopulated with Muslim women? There are so many, so that, like, if all of them are liberated, we will live in a feminist paradise. Is that the concern? Or, like, why are we? And this is the important question that we need to ask at this moment, I feel.
Okay, ma'am, thank you on that. Now, Jahangir would like to ask a question. In the context of the title of the webinar, he wishes to comment on a relevant statement on Zizek discussing feminist theory and tries to say that the patriarchal logic of courtly love creates a deadlock in contemporary feminism. So he's asking, do you relate it to be correct in Muslim community or particularly in triple talaq issue?
Can you just read that statement again?
Sure, ma'am. While discussing Zizek, feminist theory tries to say that the patriarchal logic of courtly love creates a deadlock in contemporary feminism. Do you relate it to be correct in Muslim community or particularly in triple talaq issue?
Patriarchal logic of what love?
Courtly love.
Patriarchal logic of courtly love
creates a deadlock in contemporary feminism. This is what he thinks about while he might have read Zizek, I don't know. So do you relate it to be correct in Muslim community or particularly in triple talaq issue?
I would say like, definitely like, the idea of triple talaq as an issue, if you look at it, definitely like, there is a kind of, I don't think like there are no victims of triple talaq. Definitely like, there are people who are victimized and you need to address it. But I was more concerned about what was the urgency at that moment. Why would you talk about triple talaq at that moment? Because there are a lot of other concerns. Like, for instance, Muslim feminists are not heard in this country. That's an important concern compared to the triple talaq issue. Or Muslim women are so unemployed in this country. They don't get enough education. The social conditions, like they live in such pathetic social conditions. They need economic support. I mean, like, economic independence. So these kind of things were never taken up. So I don't know, the patriarchal logic of totally love, definitely, but I don't know if in what context Zizek said it and what was the ensuing argument he was trying to make. And
Okay, ma'am.
I cannot even like think in terms of like why courtly love is connected to Muslim community alone and triple talaq alone. Like when we talk about courtly love and the Indian context, what comes to, if I heard it right, I think it is not just confined to one community.
Okay, okay, fine, ma'am. Now it's again a observation by Mausmi Chowdhury. Feminism has lost its political tangle given the structural shift to legal instruments. Even the female parliamentarians are less inclined to raise the plight of women, including increasing rapes and violence on women. So, what is your take on that, on this statement?
I think I was trying to talk about it. I was trying to say that this whole overwhelming response to the idea of legality, like, to have a law in hand, I don't think that is going to solve anything. Like, we have rape law, we have, like, these and these and these will be the punishments if you, definitely it produces a kind of awareness because during the Nirbhaya moment, it also involved a lot of discussions and debates but just by enforcing the legal parameters, I don't think it is going to stop anything or it's not going to transform the society because we have a law. Rather, like, discussions, debates, it has to be a way of living, I feel. And there's a very interesting work, this living Sarah Ahmed's work, Living a Feminist Life. I also would want to think in terms of like, feminism as a form of living rather than just a debate based on legal rights.
Okay, ma'am. Okay. Now there is one more, an observation by Shamin. Most of the politicians find the issues of feminism only in triple talaq because it polarizes us. But recently in UP, a woman was set into fire and a maternal uncle was shot dead because he complained against the scoundrels who flirted with with his daughter. No one came to help. Where are those politicians who raise their voice against this and their voices as feminist activists? So she's actually talking about how practical we are in dealing with practical situations.
That's again, I think I touched upon it. I was trying to
Yeah,
say
sure,
that
ma'am.
why did
Yeah.
yeah.
That's all from the query session. Asha, are you there? Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much again for the fantastic talk and for the answers that you have given.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you, Dr. Ashwini, for moderating the questions from the Gmail chat. Now, Sharon, would you mind addressing a couple of questions which have been posted in the YouTube live chat?
Carry on, like you can ask me and
Okay, so you have,
hello.
Am I audible? Can you hear?
Yeah. Please tell me.
Okay, we have Meera Kashiraman with a question. Actually, one or two questions, related questions. When an elite writer represents voiceless women, that is laborers, domestic help, etc., it could be labeled as appropriation. How else can the marginalized begin to find place in literary representation? She also has another question related to Indian feminism, whether you could suggest writers or books which theorize Indian feminism. Sharon.
Okay. So the first part I would like to say, yeah, representation is very problematic, especially because, like, this all these concerns about who can talk on behalf of a community, who can talk on behalf of a group of people. It's a very important question that we need to ask. I'm not saying like only Muslims can speak about Muslims or only domestic help, like, if somebody writes about it, it should be from. But one way of thinking about it is like, for instance, the important feminist activist who passed away, a feminist academic who passed away, Sharmila Rage. Sharmila has this concept called standpoint. So she was saying like it's not that only Dalit women can speak about Dalit women. You can also, like, presume like, that the standpoint can be borrowed when you understand the context from which a person is experiencing something. And they're often like, these days people are also rethinking about that terminology standpoint. But at the same time, like I would say the outsider question is a more it's a complex question. When we think in terms of identity, what are the realities that those people live through, that has to be definitely taken into consideration. For instance, if a feminist, especially a dominant feminist, talk about the rights of Muslim women in a particular context, talk about triple talaq, that feminist, if it is a responsible engagement, should also be able to envisage like the repercussions of this discourse. In the end, if a law comes, and will this be used against Muslim men in a context which is tense and Islamophobic, and where the society marginalizes this category, will this be used? That is often like, in the US context, people keep saying about this whole idea of black men. Most of the prisoners in US, like if you look at the men of color, like black men are more in number. It's not because it's only they are criminals. So there is a kind of way in which law is used against a community. Now, this has to be taken into consideration if we are engaged in responsible feminism. So you are demanding, making a demand on behalf of Muslim women, and you should know where it would end, or will somebody misuse it at the end of this discourse. What is going to happen to this community? That should also be your concern. That was like, I think that would be my answer. Regarding Indian feminism, I would say like, there are a lot of people who are doing very important work, like Nivedita Menon is there. Like you can start with people like Susita Ru and Tejaswini Naranjana and all of them. Right now, at the moment, like, all you have to do is just a little bit of Google in the names and see what are the areas that you are looking for. Uma Chakravarti's work in Kerala, like you have people, Arunima's work on Kerala history, it's very important. There is Devika who talk a lot about the contemporary issues in Kerala. I don't think like, if you look around, you can find quite a lot of names. But importantly, like, I want to like, if you're interested in feminist theory, I would suggest a couple of works like Janet Halley's work. She's not Indian, but she's talking about this idea of how, and I think I talked about it in the talk, and I saw the visual also, split decisions. That work is very important. Then Sarah Faris, whom I talked about, she's an important feminist you can look up. Then Living a Feminist Life by Sara Ahmed, it's an important work. Bell Hooks is somebody who's quite interesting to read in the contemporary scenario. So, and of course, people like Saba Mahmood, Laila Abu Khan, these are all like feminists who make a different kind of argument. Hello?
Okay, Sharon,
Yeah.
thank you for that. Now, related to this agency of women, RDSP has asked a pertinent question. Where is a lack of agency that many communities of women, not just Muslims, but other voiceless sections of women as well, stand? Is it adopting a regressive attitude?
I don't know. I find this question of agency very problematic, because we also, and this is again like, I'm not giving a very original answer to this question. This question has been taken up by many people, and people have tried to define the concept of agency, how we look at agency. Because when we talk in terms of feminist agency, we think we have certain revolutionary ideals in mind. For instance, I was citing about Sabah Mahmood's example. She says, like, if you wear a mini skirt or expose your body, you think it is like feminist agency. Or you color your hair and immediately you're treated as a feminist. But if you wear a parda or like veil, burqa, it won't be treated as feminist agency. So the whole idea of, or somebody who believes and who prays 3 times or 5 times, who goes to the temple, who does this, it is like never treated as agency. So modernity and its notion of agency, like, certain things that we think of as agency, certain things we underwrite. We think it is oppressive or she is a victim. So the question of agency is very problematic. But like, wait, because I said about this whole idea of religion or invoked religion, also want to say, actually, but there is also an ethical political practice. It's not just about, okay, I am, because we have seen a lot of right wing activists who are also women who claim themselves to be feminists. And I don't know, like, so the question of agency also should be ethical. It's not just about, like, okay, this is the agency I exhibit. It also should be about the larger interest, not harming people, letting people live. So agency is not just about, okay, I'll do whatever I want. I will go along with the right thing and say, okay, I have feminist agency. It has to be ethical. So the political also should be ethical.
Okay, Shirin, one last question.
Yeah.
Lakshman Kumar has raised a point. Many feminists nowadays are embracing the intersectionality. Isn't it one of the biggest challenges the feminist movement faces today?
Intersectionality is actually used as a positive term by many feminists, thinking in terms of, like, you are a feminist, but, like, your multiple identities intersect. You speak as a kind of, like, especially when you talk in terms of your sexuality, your caste, your religion. Intersectionality is used as a very positive term. I don't know why it is a challenge to feminism, but at the same time, like, how much productive this kind of a discourse, maybe we should, like, think about it a little more. Intersectional identities we talk about. I am a Muslim, I'm a woman. I could be like, in terms of sexuality, I could be a queer. So the intersections of these identity bring in a kind of complexity to my discourse. That is when we invoke intersexuality um, as a kind of a viable tool to engage with feminism at this moment, I think. So I don't know why it's a challenge. What made the what's the kind of, like, cause? What made this person think of it as a challenge? I'm not getting, but intersectionality has its own, like, think in terms of intersectionality. It has its own limitations, I feel, because uh, like, it's a very easy way out. It's a very easy way out to think about it as an academic tool.
Asha?
Yes, thank you, Shirin. I think since we are approaching our time limit, there are a lot of questions. So I think we would email to you because of time constraints. So that was, I hope that is okay with you, Dr. Shirin.
Yeah. If there are questions, like, and if it's an important question, I wouldn't mind answering, but it depends on your.
Shall we the remaining questions to you? Now, that was really a brilliant session, a brilliant take on contemporary feminism. Now, just reminding of the split divisions. That is what that is an apt term for describing the status of contemporary feminism, especially in India, I think, with the question of intersectionality and. Also, you have been talking about the structural shift that is experienced in this very vibrant arena of dominant as well as all varieties of feminism. So let me now come to the concluding part of this webinar to propose vote of thanks as the coordinator of this national webinar. I am really grateful to Dr. Shirin Diaz, our resource person of the day, for having enlightened us on a very controversial topic that is contemporary feminism. On behalf of the department, on behalf of the IQAC, I extend my sincere thanks to you, Dr. Sherin. Thank you. Now, our pillar of strength, our principal, Dr. Jayashree ma'am, though she was not able to be present here in this online webinar, I extend my sincere thanks to her on behalf of the department as well as the IQAC. Thank you, Dr. Jayashree. Now, moving on to our beloved head of the department, Dr. S. Devika. Now, from the very onset, she has been really a supporting figure for each and every aspect of planning and organizing this webinar. I do not know how much really indebted to her for having made this very successful venture. From what you say, from the deepest depths of my heart, as a coordinator, I express my sincere thanks to you, gratitude to you, Dr. S. Devika, for being the pillar of support for the neat and successful execution of this webinar. Now, Dr. Shubha Nair, the coordinator of IQAC of our college. Really, I would be wanting in my job, my responsibility as a coordinator of this seminar, if I am not acknowledging her contribution to this seminar, because actually in the beginning we were very, myself and Dr. Devika were very perturbed by the kind of responses that we got across the nation. So that is why we have renamed this the national webinar. Almost 1,050 respondents registrations came up for this, and we were rather skeptical how to include all these, accommodate all these participants. And then Dr. Shubha raised to the occasion and volunteered to take charge of the technical side of this. And without her, today you will not have been able to do the live streamings in the YouTube platform. So many gratitude to you, many thanks to you, Dr. Shubha, for managing this webinar, our department, as well as on my personal behalf.
Thank you.
Now, to all the participants here on GMeet and YouTube platform who made this a success, to their presence and active interaction, I express my sincere gratitude to all of you for this overwhelming response on behalf of my department as well as the college. Now, last but not least, my set of colleagues from the Department of English who have been working really hard to manage, to organize, manage this webinar. Dr. Ashwini, Ms. Radhika, Malini, and all the people, Veena, Anila, Dr. Asha Krishnan, Dr. Amrita, Dr. Meera, Dr. Lakshmi, all these people who have made this really our dream a success. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart. Now to my team of students who have been throughout this, who have been part of this venture throughout this webinar, as well as in the planning and the organizing. Thank you all for being part of this successful venture. Well, I think as a coordinator, I can claim this as a success because of the overwhelming responses that I received from the participants. And then for the brilliant exposition of this contemporary feminism, the topic, the selection of the topic by Dr. Sherin, and all the participants who have been here. Thank you all.
Thank you. So I think we can wind it up, right?
Yes, Shubha. And Dr. Sherin, a special thanks to you as the head of the department. Thank you so much for this brilliant talk.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed being here. Okay then. See.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sherin.
Thank you, participants. Thank you all.